Hi, everybody. It's Bob Ost. This is Theater Resources Unlimited. For those of you who don't know us out there, we're an arts services organization that focuses on helping people understand the business and navigate the business of theater. We have always had a special focus on producers, but over the years, we've come to realize that writers and actors and directors and all sorts of artists occasionally find that they get tired of waiting for somebody to produce them and they self-produce. So we have a community of producers and artists now that we hopefully are helping. We've been doing these community gatherings since, oh my goodness, April 17th, 2020. Originally, this was me reluctantly acknowledging that I had to do something since the world was shutting down. And I begrudgingly introduced myself to Zoom. And we started doing these weekly meetings just so people would feel less isolated. Now it's, what is it? It's 4.5 years later, and we're in a thankfully different world. In some ways not a better world, but a thankfully different world. We're not just talking about isolation, and we're not just talking about making art in isolation and dealing with shutdown. We're now talking about theater itself and all basic issues of theater. I like to find people who have interesting things to say about theater, all aspects of theater. Today I'm, I don't know how I did it, but I've got this lineup of Australian theater folk who are like the creme de la creme of Australia. I'm honored to have them with me today. I don't know why they got up at 7 o'clock in the morning to be with us, but I'm thankful that they are here. I'm going to introduce you to a lineup of Australian theater artists and producers that is really astonishing. And I have to say that this is the second time for a couple of them to come onto my show. This is my second time having Nancye Hayes on. Although actually, Nancye, you're the one person I have. I'm not sure whether you were on with her, Neil. Were you the last time? I just want to
I
let you.
don't
I just
know.
want to let you know that I
I
want
was
you
on
to
with
let you.
Jason.
Yes, you weren't with Jason, and Jason is represented tonight by Michael.
Yes, I
But
know.
when you were on last time, we put it on YouTube, and we got 17,000 views on YouTube. You were the most popular video that we've actually had in 200 and I think this is our 213th consecutive week of doing this. So I'm happy to have you back. I'm just tickled to have you back as well. I'm going to Michael Tyack, welcome aboard. Michael is a music director, one of the leading musical directors in Australia, and an award winner. And one of the things that we might have of interest to talk about, Michael, is Come From Away, since you are the music director for Come From What You
Yeah.
Were, the Comfort for when you'll talk a little bit about what it was like to work with my friends Sue Frost and her gang and Junkyard Dogs, and Neil Gooding. Neil has been a friend of ours for quite a while now, and he's been very much a part of the face of TRU for the past 3 or 4 years. When did we first meet, Neil? Do you remember?
I moved to New York 5 years ago, so it was probably about 4 years ago, I think.
It was 4 years
Probably
ago, yeah.
just before COVID, I think. Yeah.
No, it was after, because I hadn't met you live. I met you on Zoom.
Right.
Anybody
Yeah.
I met on Zoom, I met after COVID.
Yeah, true.
So, and Paul, you're here at Neil's suggestion because you have also interesting by national roots with your show Clinton, which has been done here in New York, and it's also been done in Australia, and it's been done other places too, I understand. So we're going to talk about. I want you all to introduce yourselves better than I'm introducing you in a second, but I just want to let everybody know that I plan on taking a look at Australian theater. What's different about it down there than up here? Everybody, since you're in Australia, you probably think that, oh, New York has all the breaks, and and we look at that down at you and we think, oh my God, I wish we could get something done in Australia. We kind of envy each other all the time. So let's talk about what the realities are. Nancye, I also know that you happen to have a theater that's dedicated to developing new work, and I'd like to hear a little bit about that as well. So there's a lot to talk about, a lot to talk about. I'm going to move my position so that my speakers are above me, since in terms of peerage they are. And I'm going to ask you guys to actually do a little bit of background about who you are and what you do. And Michael, let's start with you, okay?
Gladly. Yes, as Bob said, musical director. I actually just 2 days ago became my 50-year anniversary of working in theatre, which was first show I actually played in the pit for was A Little Night Music, which was a wonderful first show to start with. And that was back in 1974. So since then, I've very luckily been working very steadily in musicals. Started as a piano player and then went on to musical director and conducting. I had some great experiences. I suppose memorable ones would be Boy from Oz, on the very initial production here in Australia, which of course eventually went over to New York, which the Australian team wasn't really involved with. And then when Hugh Jackman came back here to do an arena tour, I was musical director of that one, which was great. Mary Poppins, that was enormous fun. Witches of Eastwick. There are many shows over the years. But more recently, apart from Come From Away, which was 2 years of my life, which was wonderful, there's been a lot of smaller shows, particularly at the Hayes Theatre, which I'm sure Nancye will speak about. And it's quite a bit of new Australian work as well, which is very encouraging and also frustrating. But we'll talk about that a bit later too, I'm sure.
Well, speaking of frustrating, we'll have Neil tell you the differences between the challenges of UK versus US versus Australia. That's one of the reasons why you're a great person to have on this panel, Neil, is because you've worked in all of those areas, all of those countries, and you have a very good perspective. You're kind of like my touching point for finding out what's what in UK as well as Australia. So. Tell us a little bit about your background. I'll mention it because he'll mention it anyways. Right now, he's represented on Broadway with Back to the Future, which you also did in UK. And eventually, we're going to get to talking about the differences in working in the different countries. But you introduce yourself. Because my brain isn't good enough to introduce it.
Yes, I'm a commercial theatre producer, and in Australia, split my time as much as I could between producing and directing. And having moved to the USA, sort of have had to largely give away the directing work, and it's pretty much just producing now, which is sort of bittersweet for me. But I've got to say just a couple of things quickly. I mean, I'm 48 years old, and I moved to Sydney when I was 20. And just to give context to who we have on the panel, I mean, Michael Tyack was already legendary at that point in time, and Nancye Hayes is Australian musical theatre royalty. And so at 20, when I moved, I mean, I've had the enormous joy of working with Mai Tai quite a few times now. And obviously got to know Nancye quite well when we set up the theatre that is named after her. But to give context to everybody else that's listening, I mean, 20-year-old me, if you had told me then that I would be sitting on Zoom with Nancye Hayes and Michael Tyack, I would have been very excited. And to be honest, I still am, because having worked with both of them, the legend is one of those happy times when you go, they live up to every expectation you have, and the long careers they've had. And then Paul and I have worked, a number of times over the last few years, and Paul has a pretty amazing story of what he's created. But so look, as it currently sits, I sort of now look for opportunities around the way. In Australia, I guess I found some niches of missing gaps, and part of that was developing new Australian musicals and trying to set up a theatre that was supposed to be like an off-Broadway for Sydney, which we didn't really have. And I guess I feel like I've built a career finding niches like that, and having moved to New York really to develop new work in the wake of watching, you know, Come From Away and Dear Evan Hansen and all the kind of shows that I love, like smaller, gritty things become Broadway hits. I've sort of become very the rising costs of New York and the sort of the lack of development structures here now have sort of put me to a point where most of the development work I do will now be in London. And so that's the tricky thing, is having been a co-producer on some shows and then, you know, the lead producer and driving producer on other things, I am actually going back to what I enjoy more, which is developing new works with young writers or writers generally. And sadly, I feel like I'm now living in the wrong city for that. Having left Australia because I thought that was the wrong country, I now also go, New York actually isn't really, in my opinion, now the place to do that work either. But I'm
Yeah,
sure
we've been talking a lot about that lately.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about Nancye. I'm going to ask you, possibly if you sat on a cushion, you raised yourself a little bit, we would see more of you.
Is that better?
That is better. Yes, that's better.
I'm sorry about this because it all happened so quickly. I couldn't get the camera fixed on the computer, and my skills technically in this area are nil. So,
well, I basically want the 17,000 people that are going to watch you on YouTube to know it really is you. So.
Oh dear! Don't terrify me.
Oh, come on! You've had bigger audiences than that.
All right. Yes. Yes.
In one performance.
Indeed.
I'm going to move to Paul. I'm going to come back to you, but I'm going to move to Paul. And Paul, I want you to tell us a little bit about your background. The main thing I know about you was your writing the show Clinton, but I know there are other pieces that are in development right now. And also, I think that you might be somebody who knows a little bit about development of new work in Australia versus UK versus US. I think you've experienced all three.
Yeah, so I started in, like, originally I thought I was going to be a performer, a music theatre performer, and I obviously started my training in Australia and then continued it in the UK, and I was writing Clinton and developing that while I was in the UK, and then it ended up going to off-Broadway, and so I then have been in New York, kind of between New York and Australia since then, working on various different shows. So I've had experience in like the UK, New York, and Australia in developing new stuff. And I've been, since Clinton, I remember at the start of 2020 thinking, this is going to be such a great year. I've got so many projects that are going to be announced and go into production, and then COVID. And so now it kind of feels like I'm at that point again. And so I've been developing a lot of works. I had a show premiere in Australia about the Australian who invented the black box flight recorder that's on every plane. And later this year, there's for the Australians of a certain generation, there's the TV show Round the Twist that was a children's show in the 1990s, which is iconic and was on in like 70 countries and was actually even bigger in the UK than it was in Australia. And so I've written the musical adaptation of that that's premiering later this year. And then in the US, oddly, in the US, I'm developing a very Australian show about the Great Emu War, when the Australian federal government sent the army to go to war with emus and lost. And so this is a musical comedy from the point of view of the emus, because history is written by the victors. And so Neil has been helping to bring that show to life. And it was at Goodspeed in Connecticut, they have their Festival of New Musicals, which is where Come From Away started. And so it was in that festival last year, and then should hopefully have a production there next year. But we are waiting to see what's happening with that show. But yeah, working on various other things as well, but those kind of main things going on.
Okay. And now I'm going to bring on Nancye Hayes. I don't know how comfortable you are talking about everything that you've done, but I mean, everybody's already acknowledged you as being musical theater, Australia's musical theater star. I mean, you have done all of the major female roles in all of the American musicals that have been done down there. We can talk about that too. We can talk about the popularity of American musicals versus homegrown product down in Australia. I'd love to hear more about that because I'm not aware of that much of it. What were some of your favorite roles? And the other thing I want to say to you, I'm sorry, I'm just chatting away. The other thing, the last time you were on here, you talked about how different it is having a career in Australia as opposed to how it would be in New York. I remember you had very specific things to say about that as well. So start wherever you want, because I just am happy to have you.
Well, I started as a dancer in 1961 in My Fair Lady, and in that era, there were, of course, musicals were very different. There was a ballet and there was a chorus, and nobody got, certainly the dancers didn't speak. But fortunately, my next show was How to Succeed in Business, which became an ensemble show. So we were given the opportunity, those of us who were dancers, to audition for the smaller, perhaps a line here or an understudy. I became the understudy to Betty McGuire, who came out to do Eddie LaRue. After her 12-month season here, she decided she wanted to get home, and they were thinking of importing again, which they mostly did. J.C. Williamson's mostly imported their leading roles and didn't use Australians. And then they put me on for a matinee and decided they'd give me the role, and I toured nationally in that. Went on to Hello Dolly, in which I only had a smaller role, and then Boys from Syracuse, and then along came Sweet Charity. I'd been in Boys from Syracuse, and Christopher Hewitt, who had been our director, said to me, there's a show coming into New York that I think's got your name on it, and I'll send you the recording as soon as it comes out, which he did. And of course I played it until it almost wouldn't play. And then I had to audition for it. And again, there was a bit of chat about importing someone, but they finally gave me the role. And that, of course, gave me an enormous break in the very early years of my career. My other favourite shows would be Chicago, which I did with Michael Tyack. Some years ago, it was a Sydney Theatre Company production that was to play for 6 weeks at the Opera House as part of their season. And there was a lot of controversy about them doing an American musical in a government subsidised company, but it was so successful that we started in 81 and finished in 83 and toured the country with it. So then the other ones would be Miss Adelaide in Guys and Dolls, Nellie Lovett in Sweeney Todd, Madame Armfeld in A Little Night Music. I also had the opportunity to play Mrs. Higgins once again in My Fair Lady for Opera Australia. And there's so many others, 42nd Street, Pippin years ago with John Farnham, who's one of our rock and roll royalty. I don't know where to stop, Bob.
It's okay. I mean, the thing is, it's so extraordinary for me to have you on. I mean, I basically, you are the quintessential star of musical theater in Australia. I mean, is that fair to say, guys? Is it true?
Absolutely.
Well, there are many others. There are many others coming up and established as well. Some wonderful.
Well,
wonderful.
let's talk about the business. Let's talk about let's see. Paul, you've worked here, you've worked UK, and you've worked in Australia, here being US. Nancye, you mostly or almost all have worked in Australia. Is that correct?
That's right.
And Michael, you've pretty much been based in Australia, or have you ever done any American?
I've done a couple of small things, more in cabaret performers in America and some of the cabaret convention. I've done a couple of things there with that, but
who did you work with in the cabaret convention?
Judy Connelly, when she came over. She also did a concert at the Wild Recital Hall. Down at was it 88's?
I remember 88's. That's not there anymore. Yeah. Just so you know.
Did a show there with a lovely Margie Ferranti for Neil's benefit. So a few little things like that, and went over to America and London a bit when you were being introduced to shows to learn them and see how they're being done, but not actually doing them there.
To try to expand into the contrasts between our businesses, what is your idea of the differences between America and Australia in terms of the business? Michael, we'll start with you. I'm going to ask Nancye and Paul, and Neil's the one who actually
I
has,
think Neil
has
will be.
he has the hands-on. I don't want to. He's the cheat sheet. So
Yeah. I think Australian producers, well, certainly my feeling about it is that they're probably a little more conservative in terms of risk taking in what musicals to produce, particularly post-COVID. But we do seem to have a lot of shows that keep popping up regularly. They've just announced Annie happening again. Wicked's on its second or third run here.
So Nancye, have you done Miss Hannigan yet?
I have, yes.
Of course you have.
And Lily St. Regis, you've done
I
both.
started out as Lily St. Regis. I became
Yes.
the resident director when Mike and Shannon came out for the anniversary production, and then I did Miss Hannigan in the third production, and now the
You're
fourth
the
is.
president in this one. In terms, I personally think we do musicals very well here, as indeed you do in New York. It's quite often the creatives that come out here are surprised, I think, by the quality of Australian performers, which is very flattering. It's a slight shame that we don't always get local directors or get to do our own productions, which was one of the exciting things about Chicago when Nancye did that, or we all did that together, was that I think Chicago probably didn't look like it would go on. Well, it didn't after its first Broadway run. I don't know that it was highly successful. And when the Sydney Theatre Company picked it up, they were able to do their own production. We had Australian choreographer, a wonderful designer, Roger Kirk, who has gone on to design many shows in New York and everywhere. Set designer, director, which was fantastic. And to get to do our own productions is something that I think we would all love to see more of. But I think the nature of the business is that people are very protective of shows in terms of creative control. So I'm sure that's a subject Neil will probably dive in on as well. But that would be the main sort of feelings I have about the differences. But I think we do them very well. We just don't necessarily have the variety that you get in New York or the risk of new shows.
I'm not sure how many. There are producers obviously who take risks here because otherwise some of those shows that we see wouldn't happen. But I think for the most part, producers are forced into being somewhat conservative because they're responsible for huge amounts of money that is being raised from investors who you want to see them get a return on it. The truth of the matter is that in New York, Neil, what is the statistic? Only like eight shows out of 30 or 5 shows out of 30 ever break even or something.
I know usually people talk about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 shows recouping, but I think there's an argument that since 2020 that number is no longer true. That's held pretty steady and consistent for decades actually, but I think since 2020 that number has plummeted, certainly this year on Broadway with new musicals. But I think just to quickly touch on what Mai Tai was saying is Australia has gone through phases, and I've got to say a lot of what I've learnt about Australian theatre has either come from listening to Nancye or Mai Tai talk and a few of that, you know, of the Australian wisdom. But what Nancye is not really saying, there was phase 1 as these shows used to come over from America, but I mean it really was Nancye and Jill Perryman and a few other that broke the mold of going, because there was always imported performers. Like the stars, what were called stars, usually weren't stars coming to Australia. They were just English or American. And really Nancye and Sweet Charity, correct me if I'm wrong, Nancye, but I mean that was a couple of shows in that era were really the first time that Australian performers were trusted to be the lead performers in musicals. So that was kind of the first phase of Australia sort of breaking down walls of how we would do things, because Australia's musicals have historically we've imported the hit shows. So I think what Mai Tai is talking about is we have always imported American musicals, or certainly during the mega musical era, we imported all the Phantoms and the Les Mises and that. And what that means is, and I think the next wall that is slowly breaking down, is that Australian directors in particular, but this will even apply to lighting designers and sound designers, is they don't really get to do their work from scratch creatively on many shows, because usually what we're importing is a fully finished musical that has been successful. Like, that's the other thing about Australia, is we tend to have shows that have already been huge successes in London or the West End. That's what we bring into Australia. And that doesn't mean they're going to be always successful in Australia, but we're not developing new work. So it means that Australian creatives usually get left on the sidelines to maybe be the resident director, to possibly be the person that gets to relight a show. That, I hope, is slowly changing a little bit. But the other thing underneath that is where and one of the reasons I sort of did some of the work I did in Australia and have now moved, is that we massively underutilize Australian writers. Like, they don't really get a lot of opportunities to write new musicals that go on to have a production of any significant scale. And that is the problem, because if there's new Australian musicals, then we're not going to be importing Australian, overseas directors. We're not going to be importing overseas lighting designers. So that would be the next, I hope, the next generation of where, and you can see that in shows like Strictly Ballroom and Muriel's Wedding, and Mai Tai was talking about Boy from Oz. Like, when that happens, there's Australian writers working with Australian creatives, and that is certainly a big difference from 50 years ago. But as Mai Tai said, I mean, Australia's reaction to COVID may be, I think, the smartest producing decision in the world, but it's also the most dull for me, which is that we fell back to Beauty and the Beast and Wicked and all these shows, Annie and Grease, and all these shows that are very, very tried and tested. But all of that makes it harder for any new work to find a place. But it also meant that Australia's producers did significantly better after COVID than the people that are putting the new work and the riskier work onto Broadway and the West End. So it's a hard one to know what was right and what was wrong.
We did have a wonderful thing here called the production company for about 20 years down in Melbourne, that would produce 3 shows a year, very much, I suppose, a bit like the Encore series in New York. But they would always do their own production. We'd always do Australian productions with a large orchestra, and that was a terrific sort of period. And that was one of the better times, I think, for Australian creatives, when we would have people doing the costumes and wigs and the whole design of those shows. Unfortunately, after 21 years, they've stopped doing that, which is a bit of a vacuum that's been left that I hope someone picks up in the future.
Paul, let me ask you this: as an Australian writer, are you frustrated by the fact that Australia theater sometimes seems dominated by product from outside of Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, in general, it's almost always musicals from overseas. But I even kind of zoom, it's kind of a cultural, thing. I think, like, I zoom out even further, because I remember in modern history at high school, we did this module about Australian history, and they talked about how Australia always needs approval from overseas. We always need, like, we're the little brother to some other big brother. We're the, like, kid egging on the bully, like the kid behind them going, yeah, beat him up. And, like, it used to be the UK until World War II, and then it became America. And I think we, as a country, we don't have, like, there's amazing talent in Australia, but there's just not a kind of, like, confidence in what we create. And that is something that's not just exclusive to theater. It, like, when I did that show about the Australian who invented the black box flight recorder that's now on every plane and is estimated to have saved tens of thousands of lives. When he thought of that idea in Australia, everyone in Australia went, nah, it's not a good idea. If it was a good idea, the Americans would have already done it. And, like, I think that just kind of, like, sums up the cultural attitude of Australia. And so therefore it took that guy, like, years and years before it became accepted, and he had to work exceptionally hard. And I remember that, like, I am kind of back and forward between New York and Australia, and I have a friend who is a musical theater composer who's British, and she kind of does the same thing back and forward between the UK and Australia. And I said to her, she was going back in like June, back to the UK. And I said, how are you feeling about going back? And she was like, eh. And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, well, it just feels like in America, people are willing to say yes. Whereas even if it's hard, even like understanding like, yes, it's going to be hard to do this. Yes, there are all these risks. People are still willing to say yes. Whereas she was like, in the UK, it just always feels like, no, these are all the reasons why it's hard.
Okay, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. I've got like dozens of writers in the room. They have the Australian experience here in the US. We don't feel like we get lots of yeses either.
I don't think no. It's all relative. Like the
But I'm
arts
just
is
saying
90%
that
unemployment and mostly rejection. So like that's
And the irony of that UK thing is that right now, I mean, the West End is an absolute hotbed for new original English musicals. So I do think that everybody feels like wherever they are, it's always better. The grass is always greener somewhere else. But you know, right now, clearly London post Six and the success of Six, I think it is, but there is 5 or 6 original English musicals that are opening on the West End in either opened or in the next few months. That's amazing.
But this goes back to something that we've talked about in other panels with Nancye and with you, which is the fact that there's no core commercial business in Australia for theater. Like we have Broadway here. What you have told me, I don't know if it's changed since you said it, but you've told me that there are pockets of theater all over Australia. There's no central area for Australian theater.
Yeah, it's not so much that, it's more that there is no, like, obviously if you're living in London or if you're living in New York and you have a production on Broadway and that production sits in one theater, and when it opens it doesn't move anywhere unless you go on a US tour. Same in the West End. There is no model like that in Australia. So we have 3 or 4 very spaced out capital cities, which is and usually up until very recently most shows would either be starting in Sydney or Melbourne. Brisbane has certainly become a very successful theatre town over the last 10-15 years, to the point that I actually try and open my shows in Brisbane because it's very reliable, the audience up there, and they turn up. But it does mean that depending on, like, so we've just wrapped up the Australian tour of Rent, of which I was the GM, and so we were doing 2 or 3 or 4 weeks in each city. Something like A Come From Away will do 3 months in each city. Something like The Phantoms in the heyday would have done 12 to 24 months in those cities. So depending on what scale you are, like Wicked will run for longer than Rent, but you still are really jumping between the capital cities, and that will definitely be Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. But then you may have Adelaide, you might have Perth, you might have Canberra's occasionally being put on tours now. So I don't know that I mean, that's a different model, but I don't know that really, if you think of Broadway as being split between 2 or 3 cities, that's really what we have in a lot of ways.
We also have a lack of venues, I think.
Yes.
We have 2,000 seat theatres, maybe a 1,400 seat theatre in each city, but there would be 3 of those, perhaps. We don't have a 600 seat theatre, perhaps, where riskier shows may be able to play, ones that aren't going to get 1,200 people a night. And I think that's a problem for us as well.
That's a good segue into asking Nancye, how big is the Nancye Hayes Theater? And is it, from what I've read, it seems like it's addressing the need for developing Australian artists. Is that fair?
That is what we are hoping to achieve, and are achieving, I believe. And it holds 111 people, and it's what the company wants to do is make people see musicals differently. So I've just recently done a little night music there, and it was a beautiful boutique production and did extremely well. But at 111 seats, that's not exactly a lot of people, but we did extend, and that was wonderful. They're developing a lot of new work, a lot of new work, and have presented a lot of new work, and they have also another side of the company where they are looking and nurturing new writers and work. So it's been very busy, and it's now just enjoyed 10 years, our 10th anniversary, and that was part of the Little Night Music presentation. And it's been a very exciting ride. I haven't had a lot to do with what goes on there. I'm sort of purely in name, but it's certainly a very exciting venue.
So let's look at that for a second. We tend to focus on the big commercial musicals, the big Broadway musicals, the big whatever big Broadway musicals are brought into Australia, and plus the couple of there have been also major Australia product that has come that has been developed there, and UK. Let's look at the development process. The development of not just new work, but new talent. So the Nancye Hayes Theatre is addressing that. Are there other areas in your business in Australia where there are opportunities for the development of new talent?
Well,
Michael,
I felt the production company was very good at that, because we have a number of courses here for musical theatre courses, university courses, and a lot of those graduates were able to get work quite quickly after they had graduated. And I think then they went on to do other things and were brought back into the production company for various shows. But now that has finished, that's sort of been disappointing.
I think we've got excellent training institutions for performers in Australia, and our performers are world class. I mean, in terms of developing new work, really the seeds of why the Hayes was set up was I don't know, in New York you probably remember Chris Stewart, who set up the New York Music Theatre Festival. Came back
Chris Stewart, my buddy.
Yeah. So
I was one of the people he came to for advice when he was going to do this.
Right.
I was the first person he met in America.
Really? Right. So Chris came back to Australia to be the resident director on Wicked, and then him and I started getting annoyed about the lack of development. And I'd had a few Australian musicals that we'd sort of, had to develop around coffee tables in people's houses, and that's the way that it was done. And there was no funding at all for new Australian musicals, really. I mean, it's one of the art forms that the Australian government, up until about 10 years ago, just left out. There's funding for dance, there's funding for opera, there's funding, but musical theatre was just left in this weird void where they couldn't work out whether it was a music board at the Australia Council or the theatre board or the multidisciplinary board. And so I guess Chris and I started debating with people higher and higher up the chain about why Australian musicals were being left. And this was a legacy of the fact that they looked at musicals and went, well, why would Phantom of the Opera need money to come to Australia? And why would Les Mis need money? And we were sort of saying, but if you want to develop anything here ever, you'd need to support the writers. And so our problems are systematic, and they start from the basic thing that we don't have a musical theatre writing course in Australia. We don't have a course that teaches anybody to write lyrics. We don't really have a course that specifically teaches people to compose for musical theatre. There are definitely composition courses around Australia, but not anything that specializes in musical theatre. And so it will take time for that training and the upskilling of writers, and that's where people like Mai Tai and the generations of people that have composed and been involved have been very generous to the generations below them, and that is suddenly becoming a bit of a legacy, because then the generation, I guess my generation of writers, they had some shows that went on in Australia, and they can now take the next 18-year-olds and go, this is what we learned in an imperfect situation, and this is what we know. But then it comes down to the problem of there was nowhere to develop musicals. Sydney Theatre Company used to have a fund and used to have a bit of an involvement in that, but that's kind of what we tried to centralize at the Hayes. Like Chris and I set up a thing called New Musicals Australia that was consumed into the Hayes. And so it's an imperfect system now, but it's a heck of a lot better than 10 years ago. And I hope it continues.
Very exciting that like Tim Minchin and Eddie Perfect say, with Beetlejuice and Matilda and Groundhog Day, have had success, and
Eve Blake's about
those shows are happening here, but they did go overseas to have that success.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think the sad thing is needing to go overseas to get that success.
Yeah, and like Eve Blake is about to have Fangirls open on the West End next week, and I think that may be the first original Australian score that was developed entirely in Australia, because Tim Tim had to go and collaborate with his English teams really to get his shows. And of course, he's written completely original scores and they're brilliant. But so there is this, because if you went back just a couple of years, the only shows from Australia that had made it out of Australia were Boy from Oz, Priscilla, and they, none of those had original scores. So you know, I sort of look at it and I go, there is this slow forward progression of shows that are now getting opportunities overseas, and they are original, and they are moving, and you know, and there's been smaller ones like Dean Bryant and Matthew Frank brought their show to Australia years ago, to New York years ago. Like there's been little bits and pieces happening, but I do have faith at the moment that things are improving and getting better, and you can see things. But and certainly the success of Eddie and the success of Tim, and the fact that they've both come back to Australia and they are now brilliantly positioned to sort of mentor in Australia and to keep writing their work there. Like I think that can only be great for Australia, to be honest.
So I want to go back to the smaller venue, the smaller developments, because not all of us have access to big Broadway shows and being part of big commercial musicals. We've all written shows that we are certain are destined for Broadway. That may not be the case though. Michael, one thing occurs to me, that you straddled two worlds. You straddled the world of big musical in Australia, but you've also worked a lot with Cabaret. Do you see Cabaret as being a potential source of inspiration for young, aspiring musical theater artists? Or is it a completely
I think
different...
Cabaret is a very different kind of art form, because of, I guess, the art of longer form storytelling, which is not something you have to worry about so much in Cabaret. It's a great nurturing opportunity for performers.
But also here in New York, it's an opportunity for a lot of young newcomer writers to get their songs out and their songs
absolutely.
heard.
And
we have 54 Below, by the way. We have 54 Below series which has basically been doing concert versions of new musicals, of new yet to be produced musicals for like 10 years. I don't know. So we do tie Cabaret into the musical theater world.
There's another initiative called Homegrown, which is happening mostly down in Melbourne, but it's just been doing a couple of shows up in Sydney, where they exclusively present the works of new writers, mostly just songs as opposed to a chunk of a musical. But at least it's getting writers out there and getting people interested in that writing. And I think they also have access to be able to buy those songs. If they hear something they like, they're able to chase it up, and hopefully that will encourage writers. But I think it's very interesting that a show that's just been on at the Hayes Theatre, the Ride the Cyclone, which seemed like it came up through a very different sort of model than a lot of other shows. It seemed to start as an internet, more of an internet sensation. And I don't know that we've really explored whether that sort of marketing may be a new way in for new writers as well. We're always trying to get it on, but they did get that on. But I think the recording of it and the reputation of it was all enhanced through social media and spreading through that. That may be a way that new writers can get heard. I don't know. Do you know the history of Ride the Cyclone, Neil?
Yes, it was a small show that really had no impact 10 or 12 years ago, and then particularly during COVID, it might have started just before that, it was discovered by teenagers, a bit like what happened with Be More Chill, actually. Like, it was discovered by teenagers, either through YouTube, or now I'm showing my age because probably more realistically it was TikTok or Snapchat. And then so coming out of COVID, there was one or two productions, and I think one of those had a bootleg recording that everybody started sharing, and suddenly it became like this cult show that had never had a large professional production, and it just exploded in licensing, and that's what led it to the Hayes, for example. And I think you are right, Mai Tai, because Eve Blake did do this very well with Fangirls. Like right from the start of Fangirls, Eve is young enough and cool enough to know how to connect to that audience on social media and to be accessible. And she's smart and funny, and they did, you know, Fangirls, for a show that played a couple of seasons in the cities in Australia, has an army of fans globally because of the music and what Eve did as a personality to connect with them. So that certainly has helped push it to the West End.
Paul, let me ask you this. Have you ever thought about using Cabaret as a way of developing your shows? Because we do that here in New York. It's a thing. It's a thing here.
Well, I think I've been like occasionally invited to have like a song included in, but not like, it's more like an existing song and someone says, can I sing this song that you've written in this cabaret show that I'm doing? But I haven't really thought about writing it. Oh, I will say, so Homegrown, which I've mentioned before, is a like one, so the Great Emu War, my collaborator and I had been talking about that for a while, and then Homegrown said, oh, do you want to include like what they came to me saying like, Paul, can we include one of your songs in one of our Homegrown cabaret events? And I said yes. And then I went, oh, this is a great thing to give myself a deadline to write a new song. And so then that we wrote the first song for the I Want song for the Great Emu War because of that. And so then that was great. Then we had like, and they Homegrown videoed that. So we have like the YouTube clip that we could then kind of show people to then get the first reading happened, to make that reading happen. And then we went, oh God, well, now that this reading's happening, we better write the whole show. So I do think that like Cabaret can be a way to get a new show going. It's not my usual way, but it is something that happened with that show.
I just want you guys to know that in New York, we very often develop new musicals through Cabaret because it's less expensive than trying to do a showcase or a small workshop production. So I'm hoping you'll take that with you and maybe make something.
We don't have a lot of cabaret venues left.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
That's another problem. There's even Claire's Kitchen, which is a place where a lot of cabaret performers are performing in Sydney now. That's going to be closing down in the next 6 months or so because their lease is up for the lease is being taken over, and I think the building's being torn down. So cabaret venues are a bit of a problem here. Homegrown, I think, present their stuff at Chapel Off Chapel still, which is a terrific venue that has a lot of potential for things. But cabaret venues, they're few and far between here. It would be even lovely if we had
one of the reasons we gravitate towards that is because of the complexities of the equity contract, and there used to be ways of doing it simpler in Cabaret. We can still do concert versions of new musicals in Cabaret and not get all caught up in details of the equity agreements. But equity also can be part of it now. That's a whole story more about New York scene than about your scene. I think, Ross, it's time for us to start asking the questions from the room. How far back do they? I mean, I see one from Emma, which I'd like to just start with while you look for other questions. Emma wants to know that she understands that you all are musical theater experts, but she's wondering if some of you ever work with plays, and whether there's any insight into pathways for success in community or independent theater or going from independent theater or community theater into professional theater, or this just does, or she says does just not happen in Australia. She's down there, so she wants to know what to do. She wants your advice.
Well, I certainly have done a number of plays now, but years ago, musical theatre people were not considered for plays. That seemed to be quite a divide. And then I did same time next year. I went to New York and saw the play, and Paul Rubin from Circle in the Square kept saying to me, "Do you want to see this play?" And I said, "Oh yes, I do. I've heard it's wonderful." But I never thought that they would give me that role. But when I got back to Australia, I was offered the role. So that was a breakthrough for me. I've done the Glass Menagerie. I've done a number of plays with the state companies, and commercially I've done 6 dance lessons in 6 weeks, stepping out same time next year, as I said. And I think now there's that divide that has fallen away, because a lot of musical theatre people are now used in straight plays.
We still have that prejudice here in New York as well. And I have a
Indeed.
mantra. I've been basically shouting this to the world. Just because someone sings doesn't mean they can't act. And I always use Patti LuPone and
You know, it always surprised me how many good musical theatre people would turn up on Law and Order and shows like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it used to surprise me quite a bit.
All the wonderful playwrights that have written for musicals, and you know, I did a lot of Neil Simon in the musical form, and I've not done. Oh yes, I have done one of his plays, Star Spangled Girl, but you know, these wonderful writers, and suddenly you can't act. You know, it's incredible.
I believe that singers can act, and I push that constantly.
And I think Emma's question is about
every song is a scene.
Yeah. I think Emma's really asking about if you're a writer in Australia and you're writing plays. And I guess the answer, in my, like, this is just my view, but I go, there is more opportunities for Australian, like this, so the subsidised theatre companies, which is the Australian equivalent of the non-profits in New York, like, so that's Sydney Theatre Company, Melbourne Theatre Company, Queensland QTC.
I have to tell you, subsidised sounds so much better than not-for-profit.
Does it?
Oh my God, yes.
But they do have a remit that they're going to do some Australian works in their seasons, which does not apply to musical theatre anywhere. So at least if you're writing a play in Australia, there are companies that produce Australian plays, where there's not really companies that produce Australian musicals generally. The hard thing is there is a canon of Australian music, because there was particularly our writers like Nick Enright and David Williamson, and there's a history of writers that sort of, their works made out Louis Nauer, that their works in a certain era made our commercial theatre canon, and that's got much harder to consistently be a writer in that. Like, it's hard to think of younger writers that have consistently been produced in the way that those writers were. But really, I think, Emma, the answer for that is you are at the mercy of the artistic directors and the literary managers of those subsidised theatre companies. Because, like, for example, I've got Woman in Black touring Australia at the moment. So, you know, and Australia, it's really only since the success of Death of a Salesman, of the Mousetrap last year, that we probably really haven't had a commercial play market in Australia for at least 10 years. It's sort of stopped with the production of Boeing, and there was a very successful where James Earl Jones and Andrew Lansbury came down and did Driving Miss Daisy. But it's been very hard to have commercial theatre productions. And then suddenly last year, the Mousetrap just had a hugely successful tour. And in the wake of that, Alex Woodward and I suddenly went, right, we're doing The Woman in Black. And then there's, you know, Death of a Salesman is on, and Gaslight, Rodney Rigby's got Gaslight. So there is suddenly this interesting emergence of plays that are sort of becoming,
yes, but not original, not
original plays, and they're very much reliant upon going, we have a couple of famous Australian actors in a well-known title that was probably written overseas. So really, original Australian plays are at the mercy of the subsidised theatre companies right now, I think.
So all my friends in the room who are like hoping to find out about opportunities in Australia need to face the fact that there are many more opportunities here, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah, I mean, the number of times that people come to me with their shows and go, "This would be perfect for Australia," and I go, "I don't even know what that means." Like yeah, as a subject material, possibly, but if we don't have a theatre or an infrastructure to stage new plays or new musicals, then I'm not even sure what you mean. Like, there is this assumption that I've written this musical or I've written this play, and I think it's got the same themes that apply to Australia, so this is perfect for Australia. And I'm like, I don't even know where I could start to produce your show in Australia, because we don't have the theatres or the models that allow that to happen.
But there's also for me, it all starts with school. It starts with kids. We need to do this, and probably you need to do it. We need to teach children in school to appreciate the arts. In America, the arts are just ignored in education. It just doesn't happen. It's the first place that money is always funding is always cut for the arts. If we could just
And I should
start.
say, Bob, I've just noticed here, Stephen Helper's on this call, and you should grab Steve, because I mean, Stephen has written shows. Steve was an American that came to Australia, is now back in America, but Stephen has written shows in both countries and had success in getting them on in both countries. And I'm sure he could tell you all the battle scars of what that looks like, because like Stephen has literally been through that process as well. So
Stephen, do you want to say something about it?
I'm hardly alive. No, it is no, it's what everybody is saying in terms of Australia. I think that I think money, in New York, it's all about money, really. It's really about money. The shows that are on Broadway, say, for right now, some of the musicals, you kind of think, what are they doing there exactly? But what they're doing there is they raised a lot of money to get there. So are they all great musicals? No, they're not. But they are there, and you go, well, it's really about money. In Australia, I love being in Australia, but I did move to New York, kind of the same reason you did, you did, Neil, in the sense that as a writer, for me, if I didn't make my own opportunity, there was no opportunity. Here, it's the same thing, but there is a more positive attitude in terms of that. I'm obviously, Neil, also hearing you talk about London, and that is what everyone is talking about in terms of cost, in terms of openness, in terms of excitement. It doesn't deter me from being in New York, mind you. And by the way, and yet Australia is so rich. It's so beautifully rich with stories and with talent, as you say. And I've optioned a beautiful play, a beautiful novel and movie called H is for Happiness, which is Australian, to turn into a musical. And why wouldn't I want to start it in Australia? I mean, it's so hard, and you just have to believe and keep going. And it sounds so American to say it, but it's really true. It was certainly true in Australia, because the things I managed to achieve there, talk about a lot of no's.
Okay,
But
One of
we
the-
got.
one of the problems we have
I know
here-
there's two other people that want to ask questions. I know that Mila Ilieva had something that she wanted to ask. So Stephen, can you turn? I don't want to turn your
yeah,
camera.
I just wanted to say hi, Nancye.
There you go.
One of the problems we have here is that a lot of times when shows go on, they go on for one season and then they disappear. Paul would have had that experience with Black Box. Some very good shows like Detective's Handbook, which I did back when Neil was at the Hayes, was, I thought, a great show. Laura Murphy's had 3 shows put on recently. The Dismissal, which was done reasonably commercially in Sydney. The Lovers, which is based on Shakespeare, which is always, you would think, very commercial. And
Zombie.
But whether those will ever have another season is a real toss-up.
I had
And
to
that's
catch
the
up.
problem. Because like music, as Sondheim says or said, musicals are rewritten, they're not written. And so the real way that you learn about a piece is by seeing it in front of an audience. And so when Wicked arrives in Australia, it's been through years of workshopping, it's been through out-of-town tryouts, it's been on Broadway, it's been everywhere else, and it's been constantly rewritten during that time before it gets to Australia. And we don't, in Australia, give the opportunities to do that. And also we judge shows like when Muriel's Wedding is on or Priscilla, then we judge it as if it should be the same as Wicked when it arrived in Australia, but they've had, like, this is the first time that those shows have been going up. And we don't kind of give writers the opportunity, well, not just writers, creative teams as well, everyone and actors to have that opportunity to work on a show in multiple productions.
Okay, I need to catch up with some of the. I know Natalie Moscow is dying to say hello to Nancye, but Natalie, you can come on, and then after that it's going to be Mila Ilieva. Natalie,
I'm coming, darling. I'm saying hello to Mai Tai too.
Hey,
In
Natalie.
fact, hi, sweetie. You know, Nancye and Michael and I were involved in a production that was very early in Michael's career, Gershwin.
Yes.
And Nancye helped us get that from a smaller venue onto the Total. And we had 2 seasons of that until Ira sued us, but that's another story. Remember that?
Ah, yes.
$100,000 or close the show. That was one. But we also, Michael and I did Get Happy. That was like the dueling musical directors. We had David King, Michael Tyack, and
Alan
Alan
McFadden.
McFadden, and they all tried to outdo each other, and there were 3 of us singing, and we went crazy because they were all trying to out-sing each other. It was just so difficult. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done, but it was terrific. And eventually you guys bowed out and we got stuck with the island sequence, but that's another story. But we did 2 productions of that as well, you know, so
I saw that. I saw Get Happy. It was great.
oh, great, terrific.
The Harold Arlen, all the music of Harold Arlen. It was very much a cabaret musical crossover thing, as was Gershwin, the 20s and all that jazz, which was another thing. That they were almost cabaret shows that crossed over into being musicals.
And were you working on it on the working at Kinsella's when we did the Kinsella's presentation? Was that you? Yeah, see, so this was the next step, was we were going to do the first Australian Broadway musical, and we got permission from Stephen Schwartz and all the writers to let us check the demographic of Australia and change all of working to reflect the culture that existed there at the time, and the black part became a cleaning woman who was Hispanic, so it was like there have always been people trying, but the sadness that I'm hearing here, it's making me so sad, is that now we don't have the venues like Kinsella or Tilbury or any of those places in Newtown yet where we do experimental stuff. It's just I'm very sad. I think I was there in the heyday. I was there for the Louis Nauers and the Stephen Sewells and the Michael Gows and the Nick Enrights and David Williams, and of course is still around, but you know, and in fact Nancye and I did the what was it called? The thing that we did with Last Bastion. And that was, we were doing a theater piece together at the Sydney Theatre Company, and David Williamson had written this miniseries, and Nancye played one of the leads, and I was in it too as Anna Roosevelt, sort of a spit in a cough, as they say. But you know, I think I was really there at the best time. So thank you all for letting me stay for as long as I did, and hello everybody.
Okay, and I just wanted to ask everybody: are you still okay with time? And for you guys, your day's just starting, so it may not be an issue. But if you need to leave, you can let me know. I want to get to some of the questions. I know Mila Ilieva had her hand up. Mila, can you turn your mic on and just ask your question? Okay, she's not here. All right.
I'm here. My mic was on. Can you hear me?
I hear it. I hear you now. Yes.
Oh, that's weird because it was on before. I'm sorry you didn't hear me before. Oh, so we're not doing videos. Okay, cool beans. I was very fortunate to know several Broadway stars who were stars starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and worked with Bob Fosse, and some of the shows that they did were tried out first in cabaret clubs before they were mounted on Broadway. And when I first came to New York, and I say this not to brag, but I went to school at Juilliard, and half of the people who were in the theater department at Juilliard ended up on Broadway. And it's funny because when I first checked out Juilliard, it was spring break. There were 3 cute guys sitting in the cafeteria. And I said, so what are you studying here? Because I didn't know if I wanted to go into music and drama.
Mila, what is, let's drive this into something related to Australia.
Oh, to Australia. Well, the point is that I was going to add on later on, but that's okay. People that I went to school with there were wonderful Australians who went to Juilliard, who had sung cabaret in Australia, and we shared about this because when I wasn't doing theater, I was singing cabaret, and there were wonderful cabaret clubs in Manhattan at the time. So shows would
So
try out.
basically you're backing up my theory that cabaret is actually a good place to develop new works, which I do believe in, by the way.
It's
The
a
problem is
proven theater
you have, in order for
theory.
this to be useful for Michael, Neil, Nancy, and Paul, you're going to have to go down to Australia and open up a few cabaret rooms.
Well, and I would be happy to do that because I have some relatives who do live in Australia. The point is that people who were ended up trying out their talents in Australia before they came back here and did get onto Broadway. It is that Australia is a wonderful place to do this in. So I'll just cut to the chase. Go Australia! Yippee! Thank you. Bye.
Okay, I think Neil must have had to leave. I think we've lost Neil.
No, I'm still here. My battery's just dying. I'm just plugging in.
Okay. Okay. Ross, who else had questions? Because I want these well, you see, I have to go cook dinner, but you guys just have to get your day started.
So Sue Adara says, I was lucky enough to study abroad in London years ago, and I was blown away by the support new play development got from the government. Neil, you mentioned that the government had quite a time sorting out how musical theatre would be supported. I'm wondering if it's a chicken and egg thing in terms of what the Australian theatre public expects from theatre, like how they see it as part of their lives, if they do in fact see it as part of their lives. Paul mentioned the general feeling that good things are usually imported. I'm just trying to understand if audiences in Australia need to be cultivated, educated, exposed to new works more. How do you think that might happen?
That's sort of like another aspect of what I was saying. I think education, teaching people to appreciate the arts from a very young age, and now you're just saying also cultivating the audiences.
Yeah, and that is true.
How do you do it?
Well, the Hayes in Sydney at least has been sort of a place where once you brand a theatre and go, this is a theatre that only does musical theatre and cabaret, and really the focus is always on musical theatre. We started that theatre with Sweet Charity, and in year one we did one Australian musical, which was we did Drowsy Chaperone, we did a new Australian musical, and then as the years have progressed, Wait
a second, Neil, the new Australian musical needs to be named, because this is one of the things we're talking about, the fact that there isn't as much product down there. So tell us about it. What was the new Australian musical?
That was called Truth, Beauty, and a Picture of You, which was based on the music of the Whitlams, which were a famous sort of a well-known Australian band. And the writer of that music was involved in the development of that show. But over the last 10 years, the depth and breadth of what that theatre can do, like there's always going to be a little night music or a little shop of horrors in that theatre, but it's been able to start testing out the waters of taking much more obscure musicals even from overseas, because it's only 111 seats. But it's a great progression. But if that is the dream of an Australian writer to have their new Australian musical in a 111 seat theatre for 4 or 5 weeks, that's problematic, because that's better than it was 10 years ago, where there wasn't even that 111 seat theatre to do it in. But this comes down to what I think Paul and Nancye were talking about before, which is that if that's the last time the show is seen, then we still have a long way to go, because there's a big difference between doing a new Australian musical in a 111 seat theatre for 5 weeks or having it on at the Lyric Theatre, which is 2,000 seats for 20 weeks, and so that's but again, I think there is progress. But yes, the person that asked that question is right. It does take time. So what I think we have in Sydney is 3,000 to 5,000 people now that have been, they always loved musical theatre. They loved Wicked. They loved Phantom. They also took a chance on this small theatre that was going to be, more experimental and going to do more things that they may not have ever gone to see, or what they wouldn't have even seen in Australia on a bigger scale. And that audience now has also started adopting, they'll go and see new Australian works, and they know some of it's going to be brilliant and some of it's going to be rough. But that, hopefully that number goes from 0 10 years ago to 1,000 to 3,000 to 5,000, and if that keeps happening, then suddenly there is an audience that will watch new work by new Australian writers.
RK Green tells us that there's going to be relaunching Peter and the Starcatcher in Australia this fall. That's great.
In October, yeah.
Suhadara.
So like the culture, I think with it, not just like the general audience, like it wanting to see theater, but it's also within the theater audience that musicals are sometimes looked down on, or by the play going audience, people kind of like looked at, and that was, I think, part of the problem that we had previously, when so much of new work is developed by the subsidized theater companies, and those subsidized theater companies thought their job is to put on plays and went like, oh, musicals. But to some extent, Hamilton has like helped go like, oh wait, musicals can be cool. And so I think now those subsidized theater companies, which are generally more the ones that are creating new works rather than commercial producers, that those subsidized theater companies have now started to do musicals in general much more, but also like new musicals. So what's the one that MTC is doing this year, Neil? My Brilliant Career?
My Brilliant Career, yeah.
Yeah, My Brilliant Career, MTC is doing that this year, a new Australian musical. Queensland Theatre Company is doing Round the Twist, my musical. So they are like, and they hadn't been doing that before. That's not something that they had really been doing, but they now are starting to do that. So it's even like, it's changing also the culture within theatre.
Interestingly, the Opera Company are now starting to do musicals as well. I think the Australian Opera Company are doing 4 musicals over the next 12 months, which is a departure from what perhaps their traditional brief has been, which may prove controversial. We'll see how that works out. But it's certainly, they've discovered that there's commercial gain from doing musicals. Like I say, we'll see how well that works out.
I'm going to want to let you guys go really soon, but Justin has an interesting concern. You all mentioned how there is a passion for Australians being at the forefront of new creative work in Australia. What recommendations do you have for foreigners telling Australian stories? How do we avoid appropriation? And is there a sensitivity? To that?
Australia generally, you don't necessarily need to worry about appropriation unless the story focuses on the Indigenous Australian stories. Even within Australia, that is a tricky area for non-Indigenous Australian writers to navigate. Pretty much, I mean, if someone else overseas wrote Paul's musical, The Great Emu War, I don't think Australians will be up in arms going, how dare you write a musical about Australians? But I would say, I mean, you know, like all culture, even though Australia is very similar to England and very similar to America in a lot of ways, there is a lot of cultural things that Americans writing a musical based in Australia would get wrong, and just it's just the way that people talk, the style of humor, the thing. So I don't think you need to be scared of writing a musical if it's based in Australia. But the one area you do need to be very conscious of is particularly the Indigenous Australian stories.
And I think Ross, I only see one more question from Natalie. Do you have any other questions that I missed?
Let me see. Yeah, let me see.
Natalie wants to know whether Hilary Bell's Picnic and Hanging Rock has been seen in Australia.
Did we get to Justin Whitwick's question?
No, Natalie, that has just to answer that quickly, Natalie, there was a development phase at the Hayes Theatre, and they're doing a concert in New York in a couple of weeks at Joe's Pub.
I know.
Yeah. But I don't think they've got the full. They also did a presentation in New York, but I don't think at the moment they have I think they're still in the writing and development phase of that show. So I don't think they're sort of, they haven't mounted a full production of it yet.
Is there a rival American version of Picnic at Hanging Rock?
No, this is the same one. Greta Gertler Gold is. There was an American version years ago, actually, but this is a new one that the book rights have been given to Hilary Bell and Greta.
So Ross, the answer to your question was yes, I did ask Justin's question.
Okay.
So I'm going to just thank you guys for being part of this. I'm incredibly honored to have you all here. Thank you for doing this. I'm going to go into speaker view again and just give us an official thank you to Michael Tyak, Nancye Hayes, Paul Hodge, and Neil Gooding for being with me today. And I want to thank the room for being engaged and being supportive of TRU. Thank you for being part of us. And for those of you out there in YouTube land and podcast land, if you'd like to be in the room and you'd like to actually ask questions and possibly meet the guests that I have on, I can make that happen. All you have to do is email me at trunltd@aol.com, trunltd@aol.com. And I will put you on the Zoom list, and you'll get invited every week. We've got a bunch of interesting things coming up. I don't have them in my head right now, but join us at check us out on truonline.org, truonline.org, and you'll see the upcoming programs that I have. I have things planned for all the way through August right now. So again, thank you all for being here. And if you want to have us keep doing this, we have been doing this as a service, and we've been basically very open about it being free for anybody who doesn't feel like paying. I'm going to ask that people start feeling like paying, because if we don't start bringing in some income, eventually we're going to have to stop doing this altogether. So if you come and join us, please consider paying at least $10. If you want to give us a donation and help us keep going, it's summer, it's slow, we need money. We go to TRU Donate, trudonate.com, and you can make a tax deductible donation to us. That's it. I'm very, very happy that we've continued doing this, and I'm very happy that COVID brought something positive into my life. Well, COVID brought in this awareness of virtual and the use of Zoom, and the ability to actually have a community that extends way beyond New York City. And today is certainly an example of that, where we had a lot of people from Australia with us, and couldn't be prouder of that. So again, thank you, and see you soon.